I'm Jane Kinninmont, Senior Research Fellow on the Middle East and North Africa programme at Chatham House, a think tank based in London. The experience of Iraq has really shaped the way that people in the West look at the prospects for intervention in Syria. So it's quite a dramatic turnaround. If you look back to 2004 or 2005, it was almost as though hawks in the US would have liked an excuse to say to Damascus, "You're next." Instead, the perception of failure in Iraq really puts people off having any support for Western military intervention in Syria. That may be no bad thing. It's not at all clear that having Western boots on the ground would help to fix the conflict in Syria. But instead, there's been a tendency to get involved indirectly. You are seeing an internationalisation of the conflict in Syria from many different sides. You've got now the direct involvement of Iran and Hezbollah forces, but you do also have very strong Gulf, Turkish and Western backing for the Syrian opposition forces. And this conflict, which began as something local and domestic, now can't possibly be resolved without serious international diplomatic efforts to bring this proxy war element to an end. Syria has become a place where various other tensions in the region are being played out. So you're seeing on one hand a confrontation between the US and Russia. Syria is pretty much Russia's only remaining ally in the Middle East. There's a strong military relationship with the Assad regime, and so in the minds of Russia, the opposition in Syria is part of a kind of Western conspiracy to push Russia out of the region, which is how they see it. Meanwhile, you have Iran and Saudi Arabia, who have been going through what many analysts have described as a Cold War, backing different sides in various different places, including in Lebanon to some degree, in Palestine and so forth. This has now become a hot war. You've seen Iranian troops openly enter into Syria. In response, the Saudi foreign minister has said that there's genocide going on, that this is a game changer, and the Saudis have given very direct military backing now to the Syrian opposition. So all of this makes the stakes a lot higher, and the conflict's a lot more complex to resolve. The stakes in Syria have really been increased by the international involvement. This is something that very much started out as a local dispute over the powers of the government, over the brutality of the police, over public frustration with corruption and so forth. But the strong international backing that the regime has been getting, particularly from Russia and Iran, has given them a greatly heightened feeling of confidence that they don't need to simply do a deal with their own people. They've got foreign financial and military support that can keep them going longer. Likewise, although maybe to a lesser extent, the opposition has been able to rely on resources from overseas, but ultimately the backers of each side are looking for advancing their own national interests, and they're fighting a war with other people's bodies and other people's blood. And it's something that they can be prepared to do for a long time, because not very many of their own citizens really have to suffer. There's no simple answer to the Syrian conflict by any means, and there are massive failures of international policy. It's very clear there's a real absence of policy solutions for Syria, but given the internationalisation of the conflict, it seems unlikely that it can be solved without very serious emergency sustained diplomacy at an international level, which would need to involve the US and Russia. It would need to involve both Saudi Arabia and Iran. It's been almost impossible to convince those two to sit around the table and discuss this issue as part of any international efforts. But these are the warring parties. Whether or not the West wants to speak to Iran, it's difficult to see how you can get a diplomatic solution without bringing the main parties to the conflict around the table. One of the lessons that some people have unfortunately drawn from the conflicts in Syria and Iraq is the idea that the Middle East is not in fact capable of democracy, that the propensity for conflict in the societies is too high, that people there are somehow especially sectarian or bloodthirsty in some way. But I think the opposite lesson needs to be drawn. A lot of what we're seeing play out now is to do with the legacy of brutal authoritarian regimes who have created political systems where there is no alternative except for one ruler, where other political movements are repressed and therefore have no experience, end up paranoid, see conspiracies everywhere, and also only know a brutal and violent way of doing politics. So the lack of democracy is part of the problem here. And what's been happening very recently in Egypt, where a lot of the early hopes of the Arab Spring seem to be being crushed, is an extreme problem for the West. It's going to be quite tempting for the West to not do much when slaughter is being carried out by its allies rather than by its enemies. But in the long term, this is a major problem. This way of doing politics is keeping the whole region held back. And of course we need to remember that Saddam Hussein only latterly became an enemy of the West and initially was strongly supported by the West, even when what's now been recognised as genocide was carried out against the Kurds. We cannot keep repeating these patterns or we will never see progress in the region.